So much of the work I do with clients is based around creating a better sense of self awareness. And this is particularly applicable when it comes to our capacity to communicate in both our personal and professional relationships. We tend to establish our communication and conversation styles at a fairly early age. It is very dependent on the style of communication in our family of origin. And the thing is, oftentimes we're unaware of the way in which we communicate or not, as the case may be. We are also quite defensive. We tend to go into conversations, particularly ones that involve a certain level of conflict, with assumptions. And we also interpret things the way that we are, as opposed to interpreting what is actually being said. And consequently, we don't always hear what the other person is trying to get across. We already have this preformed idea of what the conversation is going to be, and we almost twist what is being said to suit our prediction as opposed to actually being able to see things objectively. We also are very focused at a very subconscious level on what our needs are and how they're being met by the conversation. We become quite defensive if we feel like our ego is threatened anyway. And again, it's all about creating an awareness of these assumptions and of your interpretations within the context of relationships, and being able to recognize when you're being emotionally driven, because oftentimes people trigger us both professionally and personally, and we can become so reactive as opposed to being in a place where we can respond in a very calm and humble manner, recognizing that we don't necessarily know all the answers. And that's a big one as well. I mean, we tend to be very self-righteous and egoic. We assume that we're going to be right no matter what anybody else says. And it's going into any conversation or going into any discussion with an open mind and an open heart. And we have to enter into these sort of conversation and these sort of engagement with a level of presence. I mean, if we're not in the moment, then we're always going to be prone to creating something out of the situation that doesn't actually exist. And if the conversation is particularly important, I do recommend doing a certain level of grounding before you go in, so that you're very embodied even entering the conversation. So bring yourself back into the moment, bring yourself into the body using your felt senses, become very aware of the ground under your feet and I suppose the smells around you, so that you're alert, so that you're mindful, and that you're very with the person. And I mean, a person can tell if you are present, they can tell if you're actually open to listening to them and actually hearing them and valuing what they say. And there is a difference between valuing somebody else's perspective and agreeing with it. It's not saying that you have to kind of basically lay down all of your opinions and just conform to what the other person thinks. It's about recognizing that they're entitled to hold their view and respecting that, and coming at them from a curious mind as opposed to a fixed way of thinking. And also entering into any conversation with an intention of kindness. I mean, we tend to come at our conversations with an intention of getting our point across and winning. And unfortunately, when we have this attitude, nobody wins, because it means that nobody feels heard, nobody feels validated. And I suppose it's recognizing that so much of how we come across is in our intention and in our tone and in our body language. So even if we're saying kind words, if we don't mean them, other people get that. I mean, it's recognizing that you have to be congruent in the way that you communicate. You have to be as open physically as you are mentally, and open hearted as well. And, kind of trying to ensure that you're all of those things, even when the conversation is difficult, because there are going to be conversations, as I said earlier, that trigger the shit out of you and that are going to be so challenging, but it's recognizing as well the likelihood of you experiencing, I suppose, intense emotional reactions from your prior experience, and being aware of that and trying not to let those, I suppose, steer the way that the conversation goes, or trying not to get caught up in them. Honoring the fact that you're feeling a little raw and that you're feeling sensitive, but maybe even expressing that and, kind of verbalizing the fact that, okay, such and such a thing is coming up for me, and I know it may not exactly be applicable to the conversation that we're having, but I just wanted to let you know that that's where I'm at. And I suppose this is more applicable in your romantic conversations, because again, you're likely to be more emotionally charged in those. But even in the workplace, I mean, communicating where you're actually coming from is so important, as opposed to just barking out what you need to say. You need to also understand that the way you communicate needs to be in a way that can be heard and understood by the other person. I mean, it's so frustrating when we put so much effort into actually bringing ourselves to say what we wanted to say, and then the other person doesn't actually apprehend what it is that you were talking about. So make sure that they understand. Make sure that you communicate it in a way that they understand, and be very open to not having solutions or not knowing the answer. And there's a certain level of modesty and humility and courage in saying, I don't actually know what the solution is here, but I'm open to hearing what it is that you have to say. And again, that doesn't mean that you have to approve of what they say. That doesn't mean you have to agree with what they say. It just means that you are open to the fact that there is more perspectives in the world than yours, and that's again where that open-mindedness and the self-awareness comes in, because we do tend to become very attached to what we think is correct, or what we want to be correct, or what we have predicted. And it's always engaging with that. It's always looking at what your assumptions are, looking at what your interpretations are, looking at your emotional triggers, and looking at your expectations, and asking yourself, are they realistic? Am I creating a safe space for a person here, or am I going into this all guns blazing, already condemning them despite the fact that we haven't even had the conversation? Do I already know that I don't want to listen to what it is that they have to say? And oftentimes we do enter conversations with that mindset. So it's being open to collaboration, and I suppose being able to observe your conversation, even if you can't do it in the moment because sometimes you don't get the time. But if it kind of, the intensity level increases a little bit, just maybe taking a step back and asking yourself, okay, what happened there? What was going on for me emotionally? What was going on for the other person? Is there a possibility that there was a misinterpretation? And I suppose try and come back from the conversation and see it in a very scientific manner, and look at the data and clarify what you I suppose interpreted, what the other person interpreted, ask them if necessary, and then try to come to some sort of I suppose healthy conclusion or some sort of resolution, as opposed to just ending in a state of conflict. And again, it's always learning how to apologize, learning how to recognize where maybe you could have done things a little bit better, where you could have been less reactive and more responsive, where you possibly didn't hear the other person, where you weren't attuned to what it was that they actually need. Because oftentimes our communications, they just boil down to having our needs met, and that includes our professional our communications, that basically we're just looking to be heard, we're just looking to be valued, and we're just looking for whatever our need is, whether it's respect, whether it's love, whether it's connection, whether it's just affection. We're asking for somebody to meet us where we're at, and I suppose it's recognizing that they're doing exactly the same. And how can we own that, and how can we also respect the other person's needs also, whilst honoring ours? And again, it's a fine art, communication, but the more aware you are, the better off you're going to be, the healthier your conversations and consequently your relationships will be. I hope everyone has a great day.